There's a special class of problems known as discrepancy or paradox problems, where the question is essentially asking you to resolve or explain a situation that on the surface doesn't seem to make sense. As we've seen with so many other types of problems, the first step is to identify the conclusion or the end result of the situation. Then we simply ask why, or in this case we'll ask, why is that unusual? So in this case, the end result is that sales of apples fell sharply. Now we ask, why is that unusual? In the sentence above the conclusion, we find that few consumers plan to change their buying habits. Now we can dramatically simplify the argument, or the paradox or unusual situation. Or in this case, we say that few consumers change their buying habits, but still sales fell. And that's unusual. You would think if consumers maintain their buying habits that the sales would at least stay constant. Now we have to resolve the discrepancy. We need to find a reason why sales would fall even with consumers not changing their habits. In this case, the correct answer ends up stating that many grocers removed apples from their shelves, which means the consumers would not have had the opportunity to buy the apples. At this point, we can see a very key and important word in the original argument, and that is the word planned. We can see the argument was setting us up for a trap, because it would have been very easy to assume that the argument was saying that consumers did not change their buying habits. But if we get very specific, the argument just says, hey, they didn't plan on changing their buying habits, and then later we find out in the correct answer they were actually forced to change their buying habits by the grocers removing apples from the shelves. Simple words that modify the action of someone in an argument become critically important. Words like planned, anticipate, feared, hope. Those all reflect the internal thought process of a person, and that internal thought process can often be very different from the end result or the final action. Here's another discrepancy problem, and I'll warn you, there's a trap in here that trips almost everyone up. Again, first we're going to identify the end situation or the conclusion, which in this case is that tornadoes have tripled since 1953. And the reason why that's unusual is that the meteorologist insists the climate is unchanged. So now we have an argument that's dramatically simpler, which says that the number of tornadoes has tripled, yet the climatic factors are unchanged. And if that's how you simplified or summarized the argument, you fell for the trap. Because the argument doesn't actually say the number of tornadoes tripled. It says the number of tornadoes that were recorded tripled. And once we identify that the discrepancy is between what's being recorded and the climate not changing, then when we see the answer choice that more citizens are helping detect tornadoes, that would explain why the records are going up even though the number of actual tornadoes or the climatic factors, those are not changing. Let's try one more. Again, our first step is to identify the conclusion or the unusual result in the argument. In this case, the argument gives us a great contrast word, the word however, cluing us in that the unusual situation is that the credit extended to retailers that was paid off fell sharply in the first year, but it returned to pre-recession levels in the second year. Then we have to ask, why is that unusual? And if we go back to the beginning, we see that for the past 2 years we've had a recession and sales are down by about 7% compared to 2 years ago. Now we can dramatically simplify the argument, which essentially is that clothing sales are down by 7% and the proportion, notice how I'm keeping my key quantifying adjectives. The proportion of credit that was paid off returned to pre-recession levels in the second year. So it seems unusual that in the second year of a recession, even with sales down, that retailers begin to pay more of their debt off on time. Now we have to find an answer choice that would explain why they would pay off debt even when sales are down. The first answer choice talks about the total amount of credit increasing. That might be interesting, but it doesn't explain why more of the credit was being paid off on time. The second answer choice says that the rent and utilities increased. That doesn't help resolve the discrepancy either. If anything, you would think that if rent and utilities are going up, then paying back debt would be even harder. And now we get to the third answer choice, which says that the retailers that were having financial difficulties, they actually went out of business in the first year, which would mean that by the second year, all that's left are the healthy, financially viable businesses. And now we see the key importance of the phrase, the proportion of credit that was paid off. Because we're not talking about actual numbers, we're talking about the ratio of those who owe us money versus those who pay on time. And if all of the unhealthy businesses go out of business, and all that's left is healthy businesses, we still might get the exact same dollar amount every month back, but that dollar amount might increase from, say, 50% of what we're owed up to 100% of what we're owed, because all that's left is people who could actually pay us. So remember, when you're simplifying your argument, pay attention and don't easily write off simple phrases like the proportion of credit, because as we saw in this case, the proportion of credit that was paid off would be very different than, say, the total amount of credit that was paid off.